So I'm Brian Gray. I'm a professor emeritus at UC Hastings and now a senior fellow at PPIC. I'm going to just begin talking because what I have to say is the least important discussion here, and we'll have time for the, oh, well, there we go. Thank you very much. I used to have authority teaching my classes. I would start talking and they would all fall silent, but I've lost that since I retired. Anyway, you know, in some ways I think that this fourth panel is on the topic that is least considered, at least of the four that we've heard from today. But it's nonetheless been much in the news, and I think it's a very important panel. So I'm happy that we end up being kind of the anchor of of today's session. So the water reliability and safe drinking water challenges of small communities have been, as I said, much in the news, both as a consequence of drought and because of increasing scrutiny of agricultural practices that pose demonstrated risks to individuals who live and work in areas where the groundwater contains high concentrations of nitrate, arsenic, chromium, and other pollutants. To take nitrate as just an example, nitrogen is present in dairy waste, fertilizer, and other sources, and it leaches into groundwater as nitrate. Ingestion of nitrate is linked to stillbirths, birth defects, blue baby syndrome, thyroid conditions, and cancer. A recent UC Davis study concluded that while most adults consume more nitrate from food than through drinking water, the opposite is true for individuals who rely on contaminated wells. Small drinking water systems in many parts of the state, quote, regularly fail to meet federal drinking water standards for nitrate, and Latino communities in agricultural regions are the most exposed to groundwater nitrate contamination. A study by the State Water Board's Division of Water Quality, published this last August, reported that 800 of a little more than 12,000 wells that were sampled between January 2006 and May 2016, that's about 15%, had at least one detection of nitrate above the maximum contaminant levels, with most of the safe drinking water violations occurring in Los Angeles, Tulare, Kern, and San Bernardino counties. The problems of water insecurity and risks to public health have been compounded by the drought. As farmers have shifted to groundwater to replace scarce surface supplies, the increased pumping has lowered groundwater levels in areas from the north coast to southern California. And this has been especially pronounced in the Tulare Basin, which, as we know, has long suffered from problems of overdraft. In Tulare County, for example, more than 1,600 wells have failed in the past 3 years. Today, more than 600 county residents do not have access to municipally supplied water or well water, and they've been relying on bottled water and trucked-in water for their domestic uses. The county and the state are in the process of extending the city of Porterville's municipal water system to serve residents in East Porterville. The city of Tulare just extended its system south to serve residents in the Matheny tract. And Tulare County has estimated recently that it has been spending about $600,000 per month to address these problems. In a report published in October of 2015, two of my colleagues at PPIC found that about 400 rural water systems and schools in California are unable to provide safe drinking water. They also estimated that statewide the annual costs of addressing the problems of water insecurity range from $30 million to about $160 million, and that these costs are likely to grow as waste discharge and safe drinking water requirements are tightened. Now, there are other aspects to the problem: inadequate septic systems and waste treatment, curtailment of water rights and priorities for domestic water supply in that process, continued overdraft of aquifers until Sigma sustainability goals are achieved. But I think that what I just outlined will serve as a basis for at least starting our discussion today. So let me first introduce our panel. Down at the far end to my right is Darrin Polhemus, who is Deputy Director of the State Water Board's Division of Financial Assistance, which administers the board's loan and grant funding programs across a wide variety of areas, including, most germane to this panel, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the Household and Small Water System Drought Assistance Program, the Groundwater Sustainability and Site Cleanup Subaccount Programs, and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund's Small Community Grant Program. In the center of the panel is Laurel Firestone. Laurel is co-founder and co-director of the Community Water Center, a nonprofit organization that helps to build strategic grassroots capacity to address water challenges in small, rural, low-income communities and communities of color. Over the past 10 years, the center has worked with local residents from 82 California communities, 69 in the southern San Joaquin Valley, to improve access to safe, clean, and affordable water. And then to my immediate right is Lance Eckhart. Lance is Director of Basin Management and Resource Planning for the Mojave Water Agency, which manages surface and groundwater, including imported water from the State Water Project in about 4,900 square miles of high desert north of the San Bernardino Mountains. The agency also serves as water master under the final judgment in the City of Barstow groundwater adjudication. So, Laurel, I thought I'd start with you and just ask you, in addition to what I said, just to flesh out the scope, magnitude of the problem, maybe kind of just put a human face on the problem as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I've worked for about 12 years now with communities in the San Joaquin Valley, and one of the first communities that I worked with was a community where we were contacted by a group of mothers that were concerned because the water was coming out brown, it smelled like sewage, and they couldn't get information from their local water provider. They were concerned about what kind of water quality they were getting in their kids' schools, and they tried to get information, and repeatedly the local water provider would cancel meetings and eventually said, it's fine, it's good enough for coffee, stop complaining. And what we saw when we started working with them was that this community wasn't alone, that there were literally hundreds of communities that didn't have access to safe drinking water every day in their homes and in their schools, and that many of these were impacted by nitrate. Actually, this one in particular, Ducor, was one where they've had to shut down a well because of nitrate, drill deeper, and then hit an area of manganese and sulfur that were secondary contaminants, but also meant that you weren't going to drink water that was brown and smelled like sewage. And that this was something that more and more people were asking questions about, and starting to challenge the idea that that maybe it wasn't just okay for coffee, that maybe they did deserve access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water. And 12 years, or I guess 10 years later, this state passed the Human Right to Water Act, and many of those residents that were organizing locally in their communities and trying to work with their local water boards to make sure that they develop projects to get safe drinking water in their home were part of passing that law. But in the drought, we've seen even more acute and exacerbated impacts. Many families, some of our hardest working families, have lost water at all. There's thousands of residents and homes that have had no water in the drought. Many of these, story after story of families that have had to, after coming home from a long day at work, covered in dust and pesticides and chemicals, not having a shower at home that they can use, have to go to a local emergency shower set up in a church parking lot in East Porterville, have to borrow buckets from their neighbors to be able to wash their dishes, their clothes, their babies. And, I think that this isn't the reality that California should be living in 2016. And the reality is it wasn't just from the drought. It's really been a matter of years of a variety of issues, including not protecting our sources of water, our groundwater and other sources of water, not looking at how we are developing water systems, both the infrastructure and how we're investing in those, as well as the institutions. And many of these communities, which predominantly are low-income communities and communities of color, have been really the dumping ground for much of our pollutants, but also have been intentionally excluded from investment for years, often excluded from being connected to cities because of discriminatory practices, and because we've been wanting to keep low-income communities out of many urban areas. And I think we are starting to see those disparities really exacerbated in the drought as we've left communities separate from what really is a regional challenge of how we are going to supply resilient and sustainable and affordable water for all Californians.
Thank you. And Darrin, I thought I'd just ask you to just give an overview of the state's response to some of these problems.
So Laurel does an excellent job of highlighting the plight of many of these communities, and me and my staff get to visit many of them when we're doing the work. And so if I back up and I take kind of an overarching look at it from like an engineering type of perspective, I think there's the drought stress, which has highlighted something, along with an increase in contamination just from our overall usage of water and within the environment, that's highlighted that many of our systems had no robustness to handle any of those perturbances, basically. They were just barely surviving before either of those hit them, and when either one of them hits them, it's right over a tipping point into disaster for them, and they're unable to cope with what that is. So the State Water Board, where I work in the Division of Financial Assistance, has been blessed with Proposition 1 that gives us a phenomenal tool, thanks to Laurel and many of her others that have helped work to get that in place. We have more money to address a lot of these needs than we've ever had before. But there's one caveat to that funding is for capital works. So whenever we do propositions and general obligation bonds, they're restricted to being only for capital works. Many of these communities, almost all of them we face both technical, managerial, financial associated problems with it. One of the beautiful things of Prop 1 that wasn't there in prior bonds or even in the SRF that we had trouble doing was the addition of a broad, basically, a range for us to deal with technical assistance. So in the past, many of these communities simply couldn't even get past just trying to apply, right? And so, of course, being a bureaucrat, nobody gets any money without filling out an application and going through a process. And that was a hurdle too far for them. It was just way too much. And so Proposition 1 and the authors in that, I can thank that they did add in an extra amount of technical assistance to try to address that scenario. That has helped a ton. And so what I see right now is that we are in Proposition 1 in the drinking water arena doing just the burgeoning of technical assistance to get them prepared, and a whole host of planning, which as I sat back and thought about that for a minute, it's like, why are so many planning grants coming across my desk? And I think it goes back to kind of where I started. The robustness wasn't there. These communities, even though they knew they were in trouble, did not have the resources enable them to plan their way out of it. And so we're just at that beginning stage now, and it's kind of a feeling of how far in trouble we were with many of these communities and where we need to go to get them back to able to achieve the human right to water. And so I'm positive on that regard as we head there. But then there's this one missing piece. If I can return to we fund capital works, there is going to be many systems that I face when we get done with the planning and design that we will look at and say, you can't afford to actually operate the treatment system we need to put in place to treat this groundwater or to handle the surface water type of treatment that is necessary. So there is still a solution needed out there to move into how do we address that funding need, that basic right to human water, and addressing it in some fashion. And there's a lot of ways to get about that, but it is an obvious need that we have not tackled yet.
Yeah, and I want to come back in a few minutes to the how we fund operation and maintenance, and directly to your point, which is how does the lack of reliable funding then affect the state's ability or willingness to fund certain projects. So we'll definitely come back to that. I had one quick follow-up though. What criteria do you apply? And can you give us a few examples of how you've specifically directed funding? You've mentioned planning, but for capital projects, for example.
Yeah, so our funding program from Prop 1 and the Drinking Water SRF are largely, I guess I like to envision them as enabling projects, right? So we provide a funding source to establish a community program with community involvement. California is really structured on this local approach to both managing and guiding their own future. And so we try to set that up. We look for a cost-effective project, but cost-effective shouldn't be interpreted as the cheapest. There are political, environmental realities that need to be factored in and community desires there. And so, we have a process that we work through to try to find what that optimal type solution is. But in many cases, with what water resources they have available, again, we would be faced with treatment costs that then, are unaffordable. A lot of these small communities, kind of for no fault of our own, and just from a historical perspective, it was drop a well into Sweetwater, put in a little bit of distribution system, and pay for the electricity. And I think that era, both from drought and lack of water, or contamination issues faced in a broad scale of which you can't just, move another mile down the road and find good fresh water, have changed the dynamics and the calculation. Those small systems may not be, fundable or self-reliant just because of the economics they face.
Laurel, I'm going to ask Lance in just a minute to describe the programs that he's been involved with in the Mojave Basin. But do you want to add anything to what Darrin just said?
I think you captured it well. And, in Tulare, I think there's a number of different local decisions that happen. In Tulare County, there is a general plan for many years that explicitly listed about 15 small communities that they deemed non-viable, and therefore literally in writing said, we will withhold funds for public water and wastewater infrastructure for those communities, because we think if we don't invest in them, then people will just naturally go to other areas and these communities will wither and die. Well, communities really got trapped in this cycle of disinvestment from communities that really have needed it most. And that's just one example of the kinds of local decisions that I think have helped to create this system where we are. And I think we are now in a spot where, as a state, one of the things we've done is given the State Water Board not just the tools, financial tools that Darrin administers, but also these new consolidation powers, where we're saying, you have to look at if you have a system that can't supply safe drinking water, and the most viable and sustainable and affordable option is that they can connect to a nearby system, that we need to make sure that that is the solution that happens, and that we get ahead of this and don't just keep putting Band-Aids on something that fundamentally we need to ensure can sustain the increasing levels of contamination, the increasing challenges to water supply. So, those are the types of hard decisions. I think in earlier panels we heard it's tough for politicians to make some of these tough decisions, and sometimes it helps to have the State Water Board say, we're not going to fund you to do something that isn't fundamentally viable, and we want to make sure that what we're investing public dollars in is really going to result in safe, reliable, and affordable water for the long term.
Thank you. So, Lance, just give us an overview, if you would, of the actions and programs that you've undertaken in the Mojave Basin.
All right, thank you. I'm up here on stage to talk about a program that we started a couple of years ago locally in the Mojave Basin area. It's about 5,000 square miles of high desert north of San Bernardino Mountains. It has about 40 different small water systems in that area. Most of those are in disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged communities based on medium household income. The communities out in the high desert aren't the same ones that we're talking about in Tulare and in some of these other areas that there's literally no water. These are your typical small water systems that are just kind of run down, a lot of them. And along the bell curve, of small systems in California, there's a lot of them. I mean, there's a lot of probably C and D, not A or F, but C and D type systems that just get more and more run down the longer they are not maintained or properly managed. So I'm going to tell you, just go through a quick story. A few years ago, we accepted some money from the Department of Water Resources for a Prop 84 grant. One of the conditions was we had to update our Integrated Regional Water Management Plan. And for those of you who are not familiar, an integrated plan is a widespread plan where there's a lot of facilitation, a lot of collaboration. All the stakeholders that have a stake in water get together, and we all develop project lists and objectives and priorities. And we basically agree to get along and get our priorities straight within our region. Make sure that we're a good investment to the state, so we're not going to fight over monies. We come with a unified voice. So it's kind of a gatekeeper document to getting money. We accepted a check from DWR. They said you need to update your plan because you have to deal with climate change and disadvantaged communities, which were wholly off the radar screen in our 2004 plan. So we said, okay, we like money, we really like other people's money, so we're going to update our plan. We did the climate change portion, that was great, and then we went and did the disadvantaged community portion. We took that very seriously. We went to the communities where these places were located, to the traveling road show, shook all the trees, and everybody came out of the woodwork. And again, this was not even on the radar screen. We're a state water contractor. We move water, big concrete and steel type projects. This was wholly out of our wheelhouse. So these 40-odd water systems came out and said, hey, we got a lot of problems. Can you help us? And we really didn't have a good solution. So we were really scratching our heads, and we did not know how to address this at all. We met with a local nonprofit, California Rural Water Association. There's many of them across the state that do very, very good work. And they were doing some work for one of the small water systems, helping them get a grant, kind of holding their hand on the process. And found out that basically a lot of these nonprofits do everything that was being asked by these small water systems that we didn't do. They do operator training. They do grant writing, they help with planning, they get some basic engineering done, they help you with your bylaws, they have lawyers on staff that kind of help and get your boundaries straightened out and your LAFCO issues, and all that is available. But these are nonprofits, so they're understaffed and underfunded, and they do what they can with their dues that they get when you pay your membership fees annually. So we asked them, we're going to draw a 5,000 odd square mile box. We're going to give you $200,000 next year. We're going to say $100,000 is for staff to go out and visit people and do classes and that kind of thing. And the other $100,000, this is important, is to get stuff done. Because what we don't want to do is pay for a person that just goes around and talks to people, has a lot of high-frequency hand-wringing, across the table at these places and hear about your problems. We want to make sure you got enough dry powder to pay for some engineering, pay for a grant writer, do something that results in a package to get funding. And so they said, they like money, so they took the check. And we developed a small stakeholder group that was kind of a subset of our integrated plan group, and it was made up of people that represented small systems and people that can get things done. And to be part of that local committee, you had to have some skills, you had to have some desire to do the work, and basically you had to roll up your sleeves and agree to participate collaboratively. So with that stakeholder group, working with the nonprofit, we set them loose. And in that time, we have done hundreds of site visits. We do quarterly operator training classes. We've received almost $2 million in grants in the last couple of years. So basically, for every dollar we invest, we multiply that by about 5. And that seems to be going very, very well. It's interesting because it's a very local grassroots approach. And some of the kind of the interesting hurdles in this process was, the news has a lot of stories of people that just don't have water or taking showers at the church and so forth. What they don't see are these small systems that a point of pride is that they haven't raised their rates since 1970. Honestly, that was a point of pride. And yet the system is run into the ground. And what you don't see is this kind of the slow burn of failing local water systems throughout our rural communities. So first off, we had to come out and say, we're not cops. We want you to show us your systems, warts and all, and we're going to build some trust, and we're not going to get you busted. We know you're probably out of compliance. And the other thing that we really insisted on is every time you go out for a site visit, every time you touch one of these small systems, it results in a piece of paper that contributes to a stack that's going to get stapled to a grant application that basically gets other people's money into the region that helps these small water systems. That was one of the goals. And so we developed this machine, and what we do for one of these small systems, we do for the other 39, and we do it over and over and over and over. And all systems are unique, but they're not so unique that we can't have a system to kind of repeat the process. And basically in that, we've started to develop kind of a grassroots mechanism that is very, very repeatable. I think with a top-down approach, it's really hard to get these small systems out of the woodwork and get them to participate. It's very, very scary for them to put grant applications together. They might have put one together a couple years ago, they might have failed, and they'd give up all hope on getting other people's money into the region, and we actually grab them by the hand and facilitate them all the way through this process. And when they get paid, we'll help them project manage. And the last bit is we really focus on what in the industry they call TMF, which is technical, managerial, and financial. So I'm going to use an analogy. You've got a problem, your car's all broken down. We're going to help you find money to buy a new car. You get that new car for free or for very low interest. It's a great deal. But part of that is you have to get the training to operate the car correctly. You have to get the managerial training to know what to do to maintain the car on a proper schedule. And you have to do the financial component to basically maintain the car. Buy brakes, do oil changes, make sure you got gas, have some money for repairs and so forth. And without that TMF element, really that grant and loan process doesn't really move forward. So it's kind of part and parcel to that education and getting people to understand what it takes to really operate a system effectively. So not only is it about getting money, it's really about education to get yourself caught up and then being able to sustain yourself beyond that.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Do either of you want to comment or add to any of that?
So I think Lance's examples highlights an interesting approach that we need to look at broadly across many regions. There's a lot of reasons why people will say it won't work or it'll have trouble, mostly dealing with local politics and whatnot, but getting people to let go of their little individual system control, how do they join a bigger group, in a managerial regionalization or physical consolidation, things are really kind of one of the things we push a lot. We have extra financial incentives for those brave enough souls to take that on at this stage of the game. And so it's one of the solutions we're working really hard on to try to make it, because you get to a level, you have an economy of scale, you can now hire a professional staff, maybe a full-time bookkeeper, and all of these type of things that don't seem big deal, but they're huge when it comes to the survivability of these small systems. And so I think that's we can really take a lesson from that.
Yeah. Laura, can I ask you, are low water rates and maybe Proposition 218 issues related to that, are they a problem elsewhere in the state?
Yeah, this is an issue. I think you're right that oftentimes, the news maybe covers some extremes where people don't have water at all, but really communities without access to safe drinking water with failing systems is in every county of the state. And in urban areas, even where there's larger systems, there's communities that can't afford a basic amount of water, that face shutoffs. And with the drought, a lot of agencies have had challenges meeting their own financial bottom line and are looking at raising rates, and that hits low-income communities a lot harder. And so, one of the things, there's a couple opportunities, I guess, to address this. One is a year or so ago, we passed AB 401, DOD AB 401 that had established for the state water board to develop a proposal for a statewide affordability plan. And that process is just starting now. I just really encourage as many people as possible to participate this coming year. I think they've already started workshops. I know they've already started workshops. I know there's some this week and next, to really develop what that looks like. I think it's going to be a combination of things, but there's a couple fundamental challenges. One is if you're in a large system and you want to subsidize low-income ratepayers or ensure a basic amount of basic water rate, and you're in a public water system or a city, you can't do that because of Prop 218 unless you find some other source. So there's a few cases of public agencies that have done innovative things, but Prop 218 is a major challenge to being able to subsidize at least just a lifeline rate like we have in other utilities. However, just fixing Prop 218 is not going to solve the affordability problem for very small systems, because you don't have ratepayers in that system that can subsidize other ratepayers. And so fundamentally as a state, we're going to have to figure out how we fund ensuring that everyone can afford a basic amount of safe drinking water. And that's going to mean looking at statewide funding mechanisms. I think there's been a lot of concern or challenge to try and figure out what that can look like, and it really is hard to pass fees or funding mechanisms in the state. But I think if we don't, I think the amount of money that it would take to ensure a basic amount of safe drinking water, combined with the flexibility of locals to be able to structure their rates where they can do it internally, this doesn't have to be such a huge lift in terms of dollar amounts, but it will take a major political leadership.
So let's turn to kind of investments, the operation and maintenance treatment issue. I'll just throw this out to all three of you, but so what type of capital and structural improvements are going to be needed? So it could be extension of service, I suppose. It could be drilling deeper wells. In some cases, all that may be a losing game over time. Could be consolidation of agencies. So what are sort of the array of options? And is the PPIC estimate of $30 to $160 million a year in the ballpark, or is it too low? What do you think? Whoever wants to start, please. Laurel.
Yeah, I don't have a great estimate of how much is there, and the PPIC number is one of the better ones to look at for the moment. I think that that level of investment is really the starting point. So if I can go back to Lance, and I don't even want to count how many people have said the same thing of like, well, we haven't had to raise our rates here since 1970 something. How awesome are we? And I'm thinking, that's like criminal, You should be in jail because you've in essence have like thrown away a public resource, and maybe and so the crazy thought that comes to my head is 218 should have said, look. Cost of inflation always goes up, and therefore somehow you have to take a drastic action to stop rates from raising. My little get on my soapbox talk to folks when they're facing that is, everything goes up and costs associated with that, and therefore if you're not going up, what's the problem? There is some fundamental failure of how you're addressing or dealing with the cost of your system, and you're burying it in something, and you're deferring a cost out of it. So one of the numbers I put together for our board chair at her ledge hearing was when we do our drinking water needs survey, which includes the whole ramification, so jumping into large systems as well, and their needs. We're looking at a known documented number in California of $39 billion of infrastructure that is planned. This isn't like I thought I might want a project, but I've actually, taken steps to implement that project at some point, and how much money then, we can contribute from a state level, and how we focus that then, we're never going to fund everybody's need. Where is the focusing that we can do to have the most benefit to try to move things forward? And then that question still hangs out there of after we build it, how do you fundamentally maintain it? And I think there's as we mentioned, there's a lot of benefit to look at, and there are even counties, that have, or water systems that are county-wide where they've done regionalization. They operate a multitude of small systems. So there's examples out there that we can follow to try to look for how do we transition into the new reality of these little independent systems. They're going to need some kind of, either they're going to have to join a larger group, consolidation, or move forward with that.
Laurel, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so one of the major gaps right now is the individual domestic wells or and there's whole communities like East Porterville, which has been on the news because it lost water entirely, of hundreds of homes, all on private domestic wells and never with the centralized water system. And so, and there's also individuals that are far away from anyone else that are on domestic wells. Those historically have had a really hard time accessing public funds. And in low-income areas, oftentimes they also can't access private finance. And so, one fundamental challenge with financing and with our funding sources is small, very small systems and domestic wells. We've got to make sure that we're improving our infrastructure, both the distribution systems as well as making sure that there's adequate supply. That also means being able to manage our water sources better. Many systems have no meters, even on their own well, or certainly at the customer side, to be able to manage demand and respond to drought. Actually, I know Seville had incredibly leaky, it's a community in Tulare County, had incredibly leaky distribution systems that they've had a application in to try and replace for many years. They had a single well and they had no meters. And so when the drought hit, that well, the water levels dropped. They couldn't control use with their customer base very well. And there's incredible leaks in the system. And so the system pretty much lost water entirely for a while and was on bottled water. That system serves a school. It serves hundreds of residents. And so we're going to have to do those sorts of things. We're also going to have to start to treat water more. We've really contaminated our groundwater sources for too long. We haven't been protecting that from various forms of contamination, and that costs a lot more now that we have. The more that we can protect that from happening, the better. But now that we have a lot of it, we're also going to have to start paying for cleanup. Nitrate, as was mentioned, is the most common man-made contaminant other than salt, and a lot of the driving force for why communities don't have safe drinking water or now have turned to deeper aquifers with arsenic. And so as we figure out what's possible in areas where increasingly they can't find any water that's safe, they can't punch holes and find any water that's safe. Some are looking at surface water treatment as an alternative, although that is also really expensive. They then have to buy surface water and they have to pay for conveyance and treatment of that surface water to the community. So that's also not a silver bullet, and in some cases it may be more expensive. And either way, it's going to be, it's out of reach for most of these communities to be able to pay for the operations and maintenance of the treatment and those increased costs. And so we are going to have to figure out how we fund those operations and maintenance costs and these other basic needs to be able to ensure everyone has access to safe drinking water. And I think there's multiple pieces to how to do that. Bonds are a key help. SRF and the State Revolving Fund, which has federal money, can pay for that, for many of the capital costs, although we have way more demand than funding. But we still need to figure out how we pay for some of that emergency funding for private wells and for the operations and maintenance. And we simply do not have a funding source other than local residents paying all of that themselves, which they're already paying about 10% of their income in some cases for drinking water alone. So to continue to put that on the backs of our poorest residents and those that are already facing so many challenges is really irresponsible for us as a state. And I think I'm hopeful that that's something we can tackle this coming year and in the years to come.
Yeah. Let me just, in the interest of time, because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions from you all. But I won't name him because I don't think he would mind, but I just won't name him. A very prominent person in the California water industry said to me the other day that this is an absolute disgrace. This is a moral issue. And in his view, it doesn't cost all that much given the size of the economy that our water supports. And he sees it as a state obligation, not something that should be just left to or foisted on the local residents that are suffering from this. So a couple of ideas. The UC Davis report from 2012 on nitrates, which was a very, very influential report, recommended a tax or fee on fertilizer use. A public goods charge on water use has also been mentioned as a potential source for funding. both of which, depending on how they're structured, might be able to be enacted by simple majority vote of the legislature. Simple, maybe a misnomer, but majority vote of the legislature under Proposition 26. So rather than, I wish we had time to get your views on that, but I'll just throw that out there. And we'll turn it over now for some questions. And yes, and there needs to, we need to wait for the microphone, but there we go.
Good morning, Duff Sunheim. I've really enjoyed the panel. I spent the last 2 years traveling a lot of these rural areas, and I've seen the suffering that's going on. I'm not a scientist. Why did Flint get so much attention? Why does this get no attention? Is it the science or is it just the coverage? And by the way, I've seen, PPIC's done a great job in this. You read the stories in the LA Times, but then nothing happens after that.
Yeah, I mean, I have the exact same frustration. But, well, I really appreciate that this is a whole panel at this conference, frankly. I think that shows that things are starting to change, at least in this state. I think in California, there's a growing awareness and prioritization of this, but it needs to be more of a national priority as well. And I think that, I think the more that all of us can be talking about it and seeing this as fundamental to all of our lives, I think oftentimes, people drive past and take a blind eye to areas that are suffering or people that are and think of themselves as separate. Most of the population is in LA and the Bay Area. There are communities in those areas as well that are suffering, but disproportionately it's the San Joaquin Valley. And so I think the more that we have people from these communities that are part of the decision-making processes, that are speaking up, that are adequately being represented within our democracy and leadership, I think we'll have better solutions and more visibility around this. And yeah, I think there is, right now, actually, the state water board's finally considering 123 TCP, which is an MCL which is a state regulatory standard for drinking water contaminant, 123 trichloropropane. Well, this contaminant really predominantly is just in agricultural areas and some of it's throughout agricultural areas of California, but it hasn't impacted so much many of the urban areas, and so it hasn't been a top political priority. And I think we're finally starting to raise voices and get actions on issues that are priorities for other parts of our state. But I guess the last thing I would say is, this issue, we are paying now for all of these costs. Our tax dollars and the state water board put in $148 million for Tulare County alone on emergency drought response. So our lack of action is costing vastly more than if we got the political will as a state and saw this as a shared problem and that we need shared solutions and to take decisive action to get ahead of it and really solve it. So I'm hopeful that that's something we can do.
Yeah. One of the other reasons why I think that this doesn't get that much attention is, besides the real areas that are really obvious and get on the news and that Laurel's talking about, these smaller water systems, California, especially in rural communities, they're fiercely independent. They didn't drop their own power lines there. That's a utility that they're not in charge of, but they sure are in charge of their own water supplies. These are usually, homegrown systems that have been built by, sheer will of communities coming together and putting this utility together. And when it's run down, not managed well just because the expertise isn't there, this has gone on for a number of years, they haven't reinvested, they haven't paid enough, their water bill hasn't been high enough, to maintain the system. They don't want to get in trouble, so it's not something they advertise. They don't want to show their warts under a harsh white light. So you're not going to get a lot of attention. And then, on the flip side, if it does come to light, this thing that they hold very near and dear to their heart, that's something that's made by their own hands, this community's own hands, that they've been in control of for many, many years, they're afraid somebody, frankly, is going to take it away if they get in too much trouble. So one of the reasons that we don't hear as much about it, but it really is there when you start looking at these areas on a system-by-system basis, there are problems all over the place. But again, with California, we're fiercely independent, especially in these small rural systems, so they're not going to advertise their troubles. And two, if they do, the fear is that those are going to get taken away from them, and it's something that kind of defines their community and their own independence. So that's one of the challenges of why the word isn't really getting out.
If I could briefly add, I fully second Lance's approach, and it's been my observation as well of that fierce independence. And I think a lot of it is those communities have been there all along, and we drive by them. We're a very tribal species, you know, and here's my little neighborhood and where I live, and that's them. They'll take care of themselves, you know, but it's wrong. So my hope for it is that we can, in essence, define a broader community. You know, what is really our community? It's those people that live in that neighborhood that also work in mine, you know, and understanding that it's not an us-them type of thing. It really has to come down to, all of us have to share in that.
Well, and Darrin's been very, very helpful because he gives money. And so...
That's how you get people together.
Yeah, and one of the things that's been very successful, at least for us locally, is we do free operator training classes quarterly. So you get your continuing education credits, and we tailor the classes to what the rural community is really interested in. Like, what do you want to learn about? And we also use that as an opportunity to do some PR on how about working together. And this I'm okay, you're okay, and breaking down those tribal walls. Because you can live across the street from each other, and these people never talk, never share information. It's really, really kind of interesting. So you get this I'm okay, you're okay, local grassroots approach. And then the other thing that we've been doing is we've been trying to bundle grants. So when we submit a grant application to DWR, the state board, we've been trying to bundle as many like-type projects as possible. So if we're doing, for example, for Prop 84, we wanted to do leak detection. That's not really capital improvement, but it's the first step of defining the problem so you can fill out the application so you can prove to the state that they really need that investment in capital. So we got $500,000 from DWR last round of Prop 84, bundled up 24 100% disadvantaged communities based on household income together, and they all participated in this leak detection program, which results in a piece of paper or report for each one of those water systems, which is the road towards more capital improvement reinvesting. And all throughout that process, you know, we're working with that local nonprofit that's very good at this type of work to educate them on the technical, managerial, and financial. So it starts getting that narrative going, that long process, and there's that economy of scale, and they see that there's really benefits of working together. And it also gets people talking about maybe having some interties between my system and your system in case my system goes down, or how about we share operators? And it's these baby steps. It's not as fast as we want. But you know, a lot of these systems have been around for decades. These tribal walls have been put up over many, many decades. It doesn't happen overnight. Money helps break those walls down, though. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Jack Hawks again, Lance from California Water Association. And bearing what Darrin said, and thank you for your remarks on the rate design, are you requiring the systems to enter the Mojave Water Agency program to actually bring their rates up to reality if they haven't done anything in the last 20 or 30 years to be as a condition to be part of the program? I'm trying to help a small 50 connection system right now up in Lassen County. I'm going to have to go up there and face the customers. They haven't raised their rates since the mid-90s. I'm going to have to go up there and triple their rates and face the customers here in a few weeks, and explain all this to them, the facts of life. And I was just wondering if you talk about your small systems up there bragging about not raising their rates, but are you actually requiring them to do something, some semblance of rate design reality before coming into your program? This is to Lance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
go ahead.
This is one of the conditions of your...
No, I'm sorry. This is to Lance, to be part of the Mojave Water Agency program.
Well, you got to be in our boundaries, but really, we're really a facilitator. We're a state water contractor. We're kind of like a water steward for the area. We just try to make things happen, get things going. But one of the conditions of getting money from the Fed or the state is that if they're going to invest and buy you a new system, you've got to be able to maintain the thing, or otherwise you're going to be back in 20 years, back to the till, saying, I had this new system, but I was able to have enough money to maintain it. I didn't do anything to maintain it. And the state comes back and says, well, this is why you don't have anything nice. This is why you can't have anything nice, And so, yeah, it's part of the condition of the grant, and that's part of the, we're terrible at marketing. We really are as a group. We don't really understand the value of water. I've actually had people recently that are affected by contamination underneath their houses, and they can't find the responsible party and yada yada, and they've got rocket fuel perchlorate underneath their house. And we're trying to develop a small water system out there, or hook into a system, a public utility. It's from me to you. Okay, it runs right by. They can hook right in. They absolutely don't want a water bill, but they're paying for bottled water, and they tell me that they're going to continue to do it because we've been doing it for the last few years, and we've gotten used to it, and it's okay. They would rather do that than get a water bill. And I use that as an example of really not understanding the value of water. And you know, when you actually sum up the bottled water at the end of the month versus a modest water bill from the local utility, it really shows we're really not good at marketing and the education portion, because they might actually come around and go, you know, that's really worth it, and maybe I'll go out to dinner a little bit less. I know there's some areas that are really that don't have those options, but there are a lot of areas who do, that just fiercely don't want to be hooked into a utility, and that's part of it is a point of, frankly, pride and independence to a fault.
Yeah, just briefly, I always like to play the role of the bad state guy that made you raise your rates in order to get my discounted money. So Jack, I'm happy to do that. But as mentioned, the harder ones, and I don't have a problem with that one at all. The harder one is when you've done the calculations and it's just not there, and I can't make them pay that rate, and now we're stuck. Those are the heartbreak ones. It's like, I want to give you the money, you deserve to get the money, but how are we going to make this thing work? And that's the really tough question.
Yeah. Laura, you're going to get the last word on the panel. Oh, no pressure.
Pressure, yeah, I know. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's really, you know, I think we have an unprecedented level of tools with Prop 1, with technical assistance and these programs and people working together at the local level through IRWMs and with the State Water Board and with local nonprofits, local agencies. But fundamentally, we're not going to be able to solve this unless we as a state develop a sustainable funding source that can cover the operations and maintenance costs and some of these costs, and that we start to really get ahead of the problem rather than having to react afterwards. So look forward to working with you all to solve this.
Well, I must say, I found this really illuminating, so thank you all very much, and please a warm round of applause for our panelists.